Some names are worth more than fortunes because they carry the weight of a life lived with quiet dignity. The laughter began the moment Ethan Brooks stepped through the towering glass doors of the Sterling Foundation gala, his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, holding tightly to his hand as though she could already sense they did not belong among the crystal chandeliers, designer gowns, and polished marble floors that reflected every sparkling light above. His navy suit had been carefully pressed that morning, but time had left faint lines along the sleeves, and his shoes had been polished so many times they had begun to lose their original color. None of that mattered to Lily. She smiled as she looked around the ballroom with the kind of wonder only a child could carry. To Ethan, tonight was never about wealth or status. It was about keeping a promise. Months earlier, a handwritten invitation had arrived from someone he barely remembered, inviting him to an annual charity celebration honoring ordinary people who had quietly changed lives. He almost declined. Babysitters were expensive, work had been exhausting, and crowds had never appealed to him since losing his wife years before. But Lily had begged to see the beautiful ballroom she had imagined after reading the invitation aloud again and again, so he borrowed a suit, packed her favorite blue cardigan, and drove nearly 200 miles in his aging pickup truck without expecting anything except a pleasant evening with his daughter. Across the ballroom stood Victoria Sterling, the celebrated CEO whose name appeared on magazine covers almost as often as financial headlines. Confident, elegant, and admired by everyone around her, she welcomed investors, politicians, and celebrities with effortless charm. Her company had become one of America's fastest-growing technology firms, and tonight's gala was another reminder that she seemed to succeed at everything she touched. Then her eyes drifted toward the unfamiliar man standing quietly near the entrance with a little girl beside him. She frowned. Her smile faded. Without hesitation, she crossed the ballroom, the sound of her heels echoing softly across the marble as conversation slowed just enough for nearby guests to notice. "Excuse me," she said politely enough for appearances, though the edge beneath her voice was impossible to miss. "This event is invitation only." Ethan nodded gently and reached into his jacket pocket. "I understand. I believe I'm expected." Before he could unfold the invitation, Victoria glanced briefly at his worn envelope and offered a restrained smile that carried more judgment than kindness. "Our catering staff enters through the service hallway," she replied. A few nearby guests exchanged amused glances. Someone quietly laughed. Another guest lifted a phone just high enough to record what looked like an awkward misunderstanding. Lily lowered her eyes toward the polished floor. Ethan simply folded the invitation back into his pocket. "I'm not here to cause any trouble," he answered calmly. "We're only here because someone asked us to come." Victoria folded her arms. "Then perhaps whoever invited you made a mistake." The room grew strangely still. Not because anyone expected what would happen next, but because somewhere near the grand staircase, an elderly gentleman who had remained unnoticed all evening suddenly stopped walking, stared across the ballroom with widening eyes, and whispered only 2 words that would soon change everything. "Ethan Brooks." Ethan slowly turned toward the familiar voice, his expression calm, almost puzzled, as though he had not expected anyone in the room to recognize him after so many years. The elderly gentleman standing near the staircase no longer looked like a distinguished guest enjoying an elegant evening. Instead, he looked like someone who had unexpectedly found a long-lost friend. His silver cane remained forgotten at his side as he walked forward with careful but determined steps. Every conversation around him softened into whispers. Victoria watched with growing confusion. She recognized the man immediately. It was Charles Whitmore, the retired founder of Whitmore Technologies, one of the most respected innovators in American engineering. He rarely attended public events anymore, and when he did, every executive in the room treated his words as though they carried the weight of history itself. Charles stopped only a few feet from Ethan. His weathered face slowly broke into a genuine smile. "I cannot believe it," he said quietly. "It really is you." Ethan smiled with the same quiet warmth that had never left him. "It has been a long time, Charles." The older man laughed softly, shaking his head in disbelief. "Far too long." Victoria blinked. She looked from one man to the other, searching for some explanation that would make sense of what she was seeing. Moments earlier she had assumed Ethan was an uninvited guest. Now one of the most respected business leaders in America was greeting him with unmistakable admiration. Lily gently squeezed her father's hand. "Daddy," she whispered, "your friend seems really happy to see you." Ethan glanced down and smiled. He has always been kind. Charles knelt carefully so he could meet Lily at eye level. "Young lady, your father once helped more people than he will ever tell you." Ethan chuckled softly. "Please do not embarrass me tonight." "Embarrass you?" Charles replied with a grin. "You spent your whole life avoiding recognition." Several nearby guests exchanged uncertain looks. The laughter from earlier had completely disappeared, replaced by cautious curiosity. A member of the board quietly leaned toward another executive. "Do you know him?" The answer came with a slow shake of the head. "No, but apparently someone important does." Victoria maintained her composed posture, yet something inside her had begun to shift. She had spent years learning how to read people within seconds. Investors, competitors, entrepreneurs, politicians. She trusted her instincts. Tonight, for the first time in a very long while, those instincts suddenly felt unreliable. Charles turned back toward Ethan. "You disappeared after the conference in Boston. I tried calling. I wrote letters. Nobody knew where you had gone." Ethan looked at Lily before answering. "Life gave me someone who needed me more than the world did." Charles followed Ethan's eyes to the little girl and immediately understood. His smile became quieter, touched by genuine respect instead of nostalgia. "You chose your family." Ethan nodded once. Every single time. Silence settled gently between them. It was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence earned through shared memories that needed no explanation. Around the ballroom, guests continued watching without fully understanding why the atmosphere had changed. Victoria could not stop staring at the simple man she had dismissed only moments before. She still did not know who Ethan Brooks truly was, but for the first time that evening, she realized the most expensive suit in the room might not belong to the most remarkable person standing inside it. Victoria forced a courteous smile, but the confidence that had carried her through countless board meetings suddenly felt fragile. She glanced toward the nearby executives, hoping someone would quietly explain why Charles Whitmore was treating an ordinary single father like an honored colleague. No one offered an answer. Instead, more guests slowly gathered, drawn not by loud voices, but by the unusual stillness surrounding Ethan Brooks. The orchestra continued playing a gentle piano arrangement from the far side of the ballroom. Crystal glasses clinked softly, and the scent of fresh lilies drifted through the elegant hall, yet the atmosphere had unmistakably changed. Charles rested one hand lightly on Ethan's shoulder. "You still disappear whenever the world starts paying attention to you," he said with a warm laugh. Ethan smiled modestly. Attention never fixed anything that mattered. Lily looked up at her father with curious eyes. "Daddy, did you used to work with Mr. Charles?" Ethan answered before Charles could speak. "A long time ago, sweetheart. We solved a few problems together." Charles chuckled. "That is one way to describe it. Most people would have called them impossible problems." Several nearby investors exchanged puzzled glances. One whispered, "Who exactly is this man?" Another quietly replied, "I have no idea, but Charles Whitmore does not speak like that about just anyone." Victoria stepped forward, determined to regain control of the evening. "Mr. Whitmore," she said with practiced grace, "I apologize if there has been a misunderstanding. I simply wanted to ensure tonight's guest list remained secure." Charles turned toward her politely. "Security is important. So is recognizing extraordinary people before judging them." The words were spoken gently, without accusation, yet they landed with surprising weight. Victoria felt her cheeks grow warm. Ethan immediately eased the tension. "Please do not worry. She was only doing her job." His calm response surprised everyone. He had every opportunity to embarrass her, yet he protected her dignity instead. Lily tugged softly on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, can we still look at the stars from the rooftop after this?" Ethan smiled. "If they allow us up there, absolutely." Charles laughed again. "Still making promises you always keep." Ethan nodded. "Children remember promises longer than adults remember success." The sentence lingered in the air. Even the guests who had never met Ethan found themselves quietly reflecting on it. Across the ballroom, members of Victoria's executive team began searching through old company archives on their phones, trying to connect the unfamiliar name with something they had forgotten. Nothing appeared immediately, which only deepened the mystery. Victoria watched Ethan speaking gently with Lily, noticing the patience in every word, the quiet confidence in every movement, and the complete absence of pride despite the respect Charles clearly held for him. It unsettled her more than anger ever could have. Then another distinguished guest entered the circle, an elderly woman with silver hair and a distinguished Congressional Service Medal pinned to her evening gown. She stopped the instant she saw Ethan. Her eyes widened. She removed her glasses as though afraid she might be mistaken. Surely, she whispered almost to herself, there cannot be two Ethan Brookses. Charles smiled knowingly, but said nothing. Ethan simply inclined his head with humble courtesy. The woman drew a slow breath. Her expression filled not with surprise alone, but with deep gratitude, and Victoria realized she was watching another person who knew a story that she had never even imagined. The distinguished woman approached with measured steps, her eyes never leaving Ethan as though she were looking at someone she had searched for across many years. The quiet conversations surrounding them faded into a respectful hush. She smiled with unmistakable warmth before extending both hands. Ethan Brooks, she said softly. I hoped our paths would cross again someday. Ethan accepted her greeting with the same humble composure he had shown everyone else that evening. It is good to see you again, Senator Hayes. Several guests exchanged startled glances. Victoria knew the woman immediately. Senator Eleanor Hayes had spent decades championing education and innovation across the country. She rarely praised anyone in public without careful thought. Yet the admiration in her expression was impossible to mistake. You disappeared before I could properly thank you, Eleanor continued. Many people received awards for that national education initiative, but very few knew whose ideas made it possible. Ethan gave a gentle smile. The students mattered more than the recognition. Eleanor laughed quietly. You always answered that way. Victoria listened carefully, trying to connect pieces that refused to fit together. Charles Whitmore respected him. Now a United States senator spoke of him with sincere gratitude. Still, Ethan carried himself like an ordinary father who happened to wander into the wrong ballroom. Nothing about him suggested someone who had influenced national projects or earned the admiration of leaders. Lily looked curiously at the senator. Did my daddy help you too? Eleanor knelt beside her with a kind smile. Your father helped a great many people, sweetheart. Most of them never even realized it. Lily looked back at Ethan with innocent pride. He helps everybody at home too. He even fixes our neighbors' porch lights. Ethan chuckled softly. That is because they keep burning out. Gentle laughter rippled through the small gathering, easing the tension that had filled the room only minutes before. Yet Victoria felt no relief. Instead, uncertainty continued growing inside her. She quietly stepped toward one of her senior advisors. Find everything you can on Ethan Brooks, she whispered. The advisor nodded and immediately began searching every corporate archive, alumni database, and professional network available. Minutes passed. Nothing obvious appeared. No executive profile. No interviews. No best-selling books. No public company. It was as though someone with an extraordinary past had intentionally erased every spotlight from his own life. Charles noticed Victoria's growing confusion. You will not find much online, he said gently without looking at her. Some people spend their lives building a reputation. Ethan spent his protecting something far more valuable. Victoria looked at him. What do you mean? Charles glanced toward Lily, who was admiring the flowers decorating the ballroom. He chose fatherhood over fame. Those 5 words settled over the room more heavily than any speech delivered that evening. Nobody interrupted. Nobody reached for another question. Ethan simply stood beside his daughter with one hand resting lightly on her shoulder, completely unaware that his quiet presence had become the center of the entire gala. Then the ballroom doors opened once again. An elegantly dressed gentleman in his late 70s entered with the assistance of a young aide. Conversations immediately shifted as guests recognized the reclusive founder of Sterling Dynamics, the visionary who had built the company long before Victoria became its celebrated chief executive officer. The elderly founder scanned the ballroom only briefly before his eyes stopped on Ethan. His cane froze in mid-step. A smile of genuine disbelief slowly spread across his face. Barely above a whisper, yet somehow loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, he said, after all these years, the man who taught me what leadership truly means has finally come back. The elderly founder walked forward with surprising energy, ignoring the concerned look from his aide as every conversation inside the ballroom dissolved into complete silence. Richard Sterling had built Sterling Dynamics from a modest engineering company into a name respected across the country, and although he had stepped away from daily leadership years earlier, his presence still commanded instant respect. Victoria watched her grandfather with growing disbelief. She had never seen him abandon protocol for anyone. Yet now he crossed the ballroom without hesitation until he stood directly in front of Ethan Brooks. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. Then Richard extended both hands instead of one. "I searched for you longer than you will ever know," he said quietly. Ethan accepted the greeting with the same humble smile he had offered everyone else that evening. "Life had other plans for me, Richard." The older man nodded slowly. "I know. I heard about your wife. I wanted to reach out, but everyone told me you had disappeared." Ethan glanced toward Lily, who smiled innocently while holding his hand. "I did not disappear. I simply became a full-time father." Richard looked at Lily with gentle admiration before turning back to Ethan. "And somehow that makes me respect you even more." Victoria felt her heartbeat quicken. She had grown up listening to her grandfather's stories about brilliant entrepreneurs, courageous innovators, and extraordinary leaders. Never once had he spoken with such personal affection about any of them. "Grandfather," she asked carefully, "how do you know Mr. Brooks?" Richard looked at her for several seconds before answering. "Years ago, when this company stood on the edge of collapse, everyone around me was searching for investors. Ethan was the only person searching for solutions." A ripple of astonishment moved quietly through the crowd. Richard continued, his voice calm but unmistakably sincere. "He was never an executive here. He refused every title I offered him. He spent weeks solving problems that experienced teams believed could not be solved. And when we finally survived, he declined stock options worth more money than most people earn in several lifetimes." Victoria stared at Ethan, unable to hide her surprise. Why would anyone refuse something like that? Ethan answered before Richard could speak. "Because there was always someone more important waiting for me at home." Lily looked up with a bright smile. "Was that me?" Ethan gently squeezed her hand. "It has always been you." A warm stillness settled over the room. Even those who had spent their careers chasing promotions and recognition found themselves quietly reflecting on that simple answer. Richard smiled proudly. "The newspapers called me the man who saved Sterling Dynamics. They were wrong. The man who deserved the credit walked away before anyone could print his name." Victoria lowered her eyes for the first time that evening. She remembered dismissing Ethan because of an old suit and a quiet voice. Now every assumption she had made seemed painfully shallow. Across the ballroom, executives who had laughed only minutes earlier stood in complete silence, while others discreetly lowered the phones they had raised to record an embarrassing misunderstanding. No one wanted to remember that moment anymore. Richard rested a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. "There is something Victoria still does not know," he said softly. Ethan gave a modest shake of his head as though hoping to avoid the conversation, but Richard smiled knowingly. "You have hidden the truth long enough, my friend." Victoria looked between the two men, sensing that the greatest revelation of the evening had not yet been spoken, and for the first time in her accomplished career, she found herself hoping that the next words would teach her something no business school ever could. Richard looked around the ballroom before speaking again, his voice steady enough to carry across the silent crowd without ever becoming loud. "Most of you measure success by the companies a person builds," he said. "I once believed the same thing until I met Ethan Brooks." Every eye remained fixed on the quiet father standing beside his daughter. Ethan lowered his gaze, clearly uncomfortable with becoming the center of attention. "Richard," he said gently, "tonight should be about your foundation." The older man smiled. "It is. And our foundation exists because of the values you taught me." Victoria stood motionless. She had spent years studying the history of Sterling Dynamics, memorizing every acquisition, every breakthrough, and every celebrated executive. Yet the name Ethan Brooks had never appeared in any official record. Richard seemed to anticipate her confusion. "That is because he asked me to remove his name from everything." A murmur spread through the room. Richard continued, "When our engineers reached a dead end, Ethan designed an entirely new systems architecture in less than 3 weeks. It became the framework that allowed this company to survive. I offered him an executive office, unlimited resources, and enough stock to make him one of the wealthiest people in the country. He thanked me, shook my hand, and walked away. Victoria slowly turned toward Ethan. Why? She asked quietly. Ethan looked at Lily before answering. My wife had become seriously ill. Every hour I spent chasing success was an hour I could never give back to my family. When she passed away, Lily needed a father more than the world needed another executive. The honesty in his voice settled over the ballroom like a gentle evening breeze. There was no bitterness, no regret, only peaceful certainty. Lily wrapped both arms around her father's hand and smiled up at him. I am glad you picked me. Ethan smiled back with eyes full of quiet love. There was never another choice. Several guests discreetly wiped away tears. Even those who had arrived expecting an evening of networking now found themselves thinking about their own families instead of business opportunities. Charles Whitmore folded his arms and nodded. Do you know what impressed us most? He asked the surrounding executives. It was never Ethan's brilliance. Brilliant people are rare, but they exist. What made him unforgettable was that he never believed success was worth sacrificing the people he loved. Senator Eleanor Hayes added softly. He refused awards, interviews, and recognition because he believed the work mattered more than the applause. Victoria felt the weight of every careless assumption she had made earlier that evening. She had mistaken humility for weakness and simplicity for insignificance. Looking at Ethan now, she understood neither had ever been true. Richard reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully unfolded a faded photograph he had carried for years. He handed it to Victoria. It showed a much younger Ethan standing beside a small team of engineers inside an empty warehouse that would eventually become the first headquarters of Sterling Dynamics. Everyone else in the picture wore expensive suits. Ethan wore blue jeans and carried a toolbox instead of a briefcase. Written across the bottom in Richard's own handwriting were the words, "The man who reminded us that character builds companies before technology ever can." Victoria stared at the photograph, then slowly lifted her eyes toward the quiet father she had nearly asked security to remove. At that moment she realized she had not merely misjudged a guest. She had misunderstood the very definition of greatness. Victoria continued staring at the faded photograph, her fingertips resting lightly against its worn edges as though she were afraid it might disappear. Around her, the ballroom remained unusually quiet. No one seemed interested in returning to business conversations or polite introductions. The evening had taken on an entirely different meaning. She slowly handed the photograph back to Richard, then looked directly at Ethan for what felt like the first time. She no longer saw an aging suit or a quiet father standing beside his daughter. She saw a man who had walked away from extraordinary wealth without bitterness, who had chosen love over recognition, and who had accepted humiliation without demanding an apology. She took a slow breath before speaking. "Mr. Brooks," she said sincerely, "I owe you more than an apology." Ethan offered a gentle smile. "You do not owe me anything." Victoria lowered her eyes for a brief moment. "I judged you before I knew you." Ethan answered with calm honesty. "That happens more often than people realize." There was no accusation in his voice, only understanding. Somehow that made his words even heavier. Charles Whitmore quietly folded his hands. "That is one of Ethan's rare gifts," he said. "He never lets another person's mistake become the beginning of resentment." Senator Eleanor Hayes nodded. "He always believed that grace changes people more deeply than humiliation ever could." Victoria felt every sentence settling inside her heart. She had spent years building a reputation for decisive leadership, yet standing before Ethan she realized how easily confidence could become pride when it was separated from compassion. She looked toward Lily, who was quietly admiring a centerpiece filled with white roses. "Were you frightened earlier?" Victoria asked softly. Lily looked up with the complete honesty that only a child could offer. "A little. I thought maybe we were not supposed to be here." Victoria's expression fell. "I am so sorry." Lily smiled gently. "Daddy told me sometimes people only see what is on the outside because they have not had enough time to see the heart yet." Several guests lowered their heads after hearing those simple words. Ethan looked at his daughter with quiet pride. "You remembered." Lily nodded happily. "You tell me that all the time." Richard smiled as he watched them. "That may be the most valuable lesson anyone has shared in this ballroom tonight." Victoria slowly removed the elegant name badge identifying her as Chief Executive Officer and placed it on the nearby reception table. For the first time since the gala had begun, she wanted to speak not as the leader of a company, but simply as another human being. "Ethan," she said gently, "would you allow me the chance to start over?" Ethan nodded without hesitation. Everyone deserves a second chance. The answer carried no hesitation because he had clearly believed those words long before tonight. A quiet warmth spread through the room as guests exchanged thoughtful glances. The tension that had once divided the ballroom was beginning to dissolve into something far more meaningful. Yet Richard was watching his granddaughter with a thoughtful expression. After a long moment, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket once more and carefully removed a sealed envelope that had yellowed slightly with age. He held it toward Victoria without opening it. "Your father asked me to give you this only when the time was right," he said quietly. "I think that moment has finally arrived." Victoria accepted the envelope with trembling hands. Across the front, written in familiar handwriting she had not seen in many years, were 7 simple words that immediately caught her breath. "If you ever meet Ethan Brooks again, listen before you speak." Victoria held the sealed envelope with both hands, staring at her late father's handwriting as though time itself had paused inside the ballroom. The elegant music continued in the background, but it seemed impossibly distant now. She carefully opened the envelope, unfolded the single sheet of paper, and quietly began to read. After only a few lines, her eyes filled with emotion. She lowered the letter for a moment before gathering herself and reading the words aloud. "If life ever brings Ethan Brooks back into your path, do not measure him by the clothes he wears or the title he refuses. Listen carefully. You will learn more about leadership from 1 hour beside him than from a lifetime of board meetings." The room remained completely silent. Richard lowered his head with quiet respect. Charles Whitmore closed his eyes briefly, remembering the friend who had written those words years before. Victoria continued reading. "I offered Ethan every opportunity to become one of the wealthiest men in America. He thanked me with kindness and declined because his family needed him. Never mistake that decision for a lack of ambition. It was the highest form of ambition I have ever witnessed. He understood something that many successful people forget. Careers can always be rebuilt. Childhood cannot." Victoria stopped reading as her voice trembled. She folded the letter carefully and looked toward Ethan, who stood exactly as he had all evening, one hand resting gently on Lily's shoulder, never asking for recognition, never trying to explain himself. "My father never told me this," she whispered. Richard answered softly. He intended to. He simply ran out of time. The words settled gently across the room. Victoria slowly walked toward Ethan until only a few feet separated them. "I have spent years trying to become the leader my family expected," she said quietly. "Tonight, I realized I never truly understood what they were trying to teach me." Ethan smiled with quiet understanding. "Every day gives us another chance to learn." Victoria nodded. "Would you allow me to show you and Lily the rooftop garden? It is the most peaceful place in the building." Lily's face immediately brightened. "Daddy, that is where we wanted to see the stars." Ethan looked down at his daughter before meeting Victoria's eyes again. "If you were certain we would not be interrupting anything." Victoria smiled for the first time that evening without the confidence of a celebrated executive. This smile carried simple sincerity. "You would be honoring us." Together they walked toward the private elevator while many guests quietly stepped aside to let them pass. No one applauded. No one spoke. Respect did not require noise. Minutes later, the elevator doors opened onto the rooftop terrace. A gentle summer breeze drifted across the garden, carrying the scent of lavender and fresh cedar. The city lights stretched for miles beneath a sky where the first stars had begun to appear. Lily walked toward the stone railing with childlike wonder. "It looks like the whole world is sparkling," she whispered. Ethan stood beside her, smiling peacefully. Victoria watched the simple moment unfold and suddenly understood why a man could willingly leave extraordinary wealth behind. Some treasures could never be measured in dollars, stock certificates, or headlines. They existed only in moments like this, shared quietly beneath an open sky. As Richard stepped onto the terrace behind them, he looked toward Ethan with a knowing smile and said, "There is one final truth they still deserve to hear, and tonight, for the first time in many years, I believe you are finally ready to tell it." Richard's words lingered in the cool evening air as the city lights shimmered below like countless quiet promises waiting to be kept. Ethan rested both hands on the stone railing beside Lily, who was happily searching the sky for the brightest star she could find. He remained silent for several moments, not because he was searching for the right answer, but because he had never believed his story deserved to become someone else's lesson. Finally, he smiled gently. "There is no great secret," he said. "Only a choice that I kept making every single day." Victoria stood beside him, listening with complete attention. Ethan continued softly. "People often asked why I walked away from opportunities that could have changed my life. The truth is that they did change my life. They simply changed it in a different direction." He looked toward Lily. "When my wife became sick, every meeting I skipped meant another evening beside her. Every promotion I declined meant another morning making breakfast with my family. After she was gone, every offer I refused meant another bedtime story, another school concert, another chance to remind my daughter that she was never facing the world alone." Lily reached for his hand and smiled. "You never missed a single one." Ethan smiled back. "Because those moments were the career I wanted most." A peaceful silence settled across the rooftop. Even the distant sounds of traffic seemed softer beneath the warm summer sky. Richard looked toward Victoria. "Your father understood that before he passed away. He told me he admired Ethan not because he solved impossible engineering problems, but because he never confused success with significance." Victoria slowly folded the letter and placed it carefully inside her evening purse. "I spent years believing leadership meant staying one step ahead of everyone else," she admitted. "Tonight, I learned it begins with seeing the worth in someone before the world applauds them." Charles Whitmore smiled quietly. "That lesson has made better leaders than any business school ever could." Lily suddenly pointed toward the sky with excitement. "Look, Daddy, there is the first really bright star." Ethan looked upward and nodded. "Your mother used to say the brightest lights never need to announce themselves. They simply shine." Victoria felt tears gathering in her eyes, not from sadness, but from gratitude for witnessing something money could never purchase. She turned toward Ethan. "I cannot change the way I greeted you tonight." Ethan shook his head gently. "None of us can change yesterday," she continued, "but I can choose who I become tomorrow." Ethan smiled with quiet warmth. "That is all any of us can do." Richard extended his hand toward Ethan one final time. "Thank you for coming tonight." Ethan accepted it with genuine humility. "Thank you for reminding people that kindness still has a place in rooms like these." A short time later, Ethan and Lily walked back through the ballroom toward the exit. Guests instinctively stepped aside, not because anyone instructed them to, but because respect had quietly replaced every earlier assumption. No cameras followed them. No speeches interrupted their departure. Victoria stood near the entrance watching the father and daughter disappear into the peaceful night, their old pickup truck waiting beneath the soft glow of the parking lot lights. She realized that the most remarkable person who had attended her gala was also the only one who had asked for nothing. As Ethan drove away with Lily happily talking about the stars, Victoria remained standing in thoughtful silence, understanding at last that true greatness never demands recognition. It is revealed through quiet dignity, faithful love, and the simple courage to choose people over prestige, again and again, until even a single name is enough to remind an entire room what truly matters.